Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network.
It's in the trees. It's coming.
Now, the Chris Evers, Philip Mantle, Inside Outer Limits radio show, Flying Disc Press, Outer Limits magazine endorse any of the products you may have heard advertised at the beginning or the end of this show or inserted into the middle of this show. The only products we do endorse are those that are strictly affiliated to Outer Limits magazine or to Flying Disc Press. We now hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
Hello everybody once more and welcome to another episode of the Inside Outer Limits radio show with myself, Chris Evers, the man from Outer Limits magazine, and also my co-host, who is of course better known as UFO royalty, Mr. Philip Mantle. Hello Phil.
Good evening, Chris.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. You know,
Excellent.
busy as usual, but yes, everything's hunky dory.
Excellent. I'm sure David Bowie copyrighted that one once. So, Phil, we've got a very interesting guest today, haven't we?
We have a gentleman, again, this time across the Atlantic, by the name of Ralph Blumenthal. For those that are not aware, Ralph was a journalist and reporter for the New York Times from 1964 right the way through to 2009. And he has authored a number of books based on investigative crime reporting and cultural history. Now, his latest book, not crime reporting, although it could be in a kind of way, it's called The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. It's recently been published by High Road Books. I believe it came out on March the 15th. Now, this is the first biography of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard physicist, Dr. John Mack, who sadly left us in 2004. And his research into the abduction phenomenon, of course, risked his career. And I'm sure we'll find out more about that when we speak to our guest, Ralph. Good evening, Ralph.
Good evening. Nice to be with you.
Welcome, Ralph. How are you today, sir?
Thank you. It's great here in New York. We have spring, and it's a beautiful day, so everything is great.
Well, I'm jealous already. I've got a lovely grey sky here in Kingston upon Hull. In
Wait
England.
a minute, grey skies?
Yes,
skies in the UK? I can't believe it.
No, it doesn't rain here often, really.
No, I can't believe it either, Ralph. I'm in West Yorkshire, about an hour or so from Chris. It never rains here. It's always sunny here.
That's what I heard.
And that's inclusive middle of winter at 7:30 in the evening as well, isn't it, Phil?
Of course, it's always sunny here. I live in a small town called Pontefract, Ralph. I'm sure you know of it.
Oh, very well, yeah.
But it's a real pleasure to speak to you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. And, I was reflecting that John Mack had a lot to do with the UK. So, in a way, we have a lot in common.
Excellent.
Yes.
So,
right, Chris.
it's my understanding, if I remember correctly, that Dr. Mack actually he passed away in the United Kingdom, didn't he?
Unfortunately, he did. He did what a lot of tourists do. He looked the wrong way down a street in London, and came out of a tube station. It was late at night. He was tired. Looked the wrong way, and he got mowed down by a man who had too much to drink. That in itself is interesting because, as given what John Mack was involved in, immediately conspiracy theories sprang up that he had been assassinated, and that still flourishes on the internet. You still get, wind of that, but it's not true. I checked it out very thoroughly with the police reports, and it was truly an accident.
Yeah, it was a great loss, I must admit. Before we carry on talking about your book, What I want to know, Ralph, is how did you get involved with the subject of ufology? What was it about it that attracted you?
Well, my whole career was very, I would say, earth based. I was not a ufologist. I read science fiction as a kid, like everybody in my generation. But then I went on to a career at the New York Times, covering, doing investigative reporting. I wrote about the mafia. I wrote about the Holocaust. I wrote about corrupt politicians, and so it wasn't on my radar. And in 2004, I was a correspondent in the American Southwest, based in Texas, and I picked up a copy of a used book called Passport to the Cosmos, which was John Mack's second book. And I didn't know about him. All I could see was that he was a public psychiatrist, a very highly Harvard establishment, and was interested in alien abduction. And I thought that in itself was interesting. So again, naively, and I was naive, John was naive, as we can discuss, perhaps a little too much for his, professional standing. But anyway, he was certainly a great hero. But I was naive in that I didn't know anything about him. He had already been on the Oprah Winfrey Show. He had been extensively on alien abduction. He'd been in the press, including my own paper, the New York Times, but I had skipped over that. So I read the book and I said, boy, I got to give this guy a call and make a great interview. I didn't realize how famous he already was. And lo and behold, a few days later, I picked up the paper and he was dead. He had been run over in London, as we just discussed. Mm-hmm. So I made contact with the family. I said, gee, I would have liked to interview him. And now, it'd be wonderful to do an article or even a book. And little by little, they opened up their archives to me, and that became the book. So 16 years ago, I started. That's how I got into it.
So what was it that brought Dr. Mack into this then?
That's an interesting story.
It's all right. We've got an hour and a half. You're okay.
That one question might take an hour and a half. No, that's a very good question, because he was also very unlikely to go into this field. He was brought up in a secular German Jewish household. His parents were both professors. They were not spiritual, as he often said. They read the Bible at home as literature and not as the Word of God. So he was brought up as a sort of in a world of scientific materialism. And his early career was, again, very firmly, based on this planet. He reformed mental health care in a section of Boston that was very poor. He then went to see Lawrence of Arabia, like we all did at that time. We walked out saying, boy, that's a long movie. Good movie, but long.
I would agree with that.
He walked out saying, I got to find out about this Lawrence guy. So he spent 12 years researching Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, including trips to Oxford, to London, and to the Middle East. He did a groundbreaking psychological biography of Lawrence that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1977. It was a tour de force. And but that still didn't bring him to abduction. There were a few more steps in his life that were necessary. Writing the Lawrence book made him ipso facto a Middle East expert. So he traveled to the Middle East and he met with Yasser Arafat to try to secure peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. He then got into anti-nuclear weapons protests with his family. He protested the nuclear test site in Nevada, and he got arrested with his family there. And that still didn't take him into the UFO realm. So what did? What happened is he got interested in a method of consciousness raising called holotropic breathing, whereby regulated breathing you can raise you can enter altered states of consciousness, sort of drugs without drugs. And he found his way to Esalen, which is that, that psychic think tank on the Pacific with all kinds of interesting experiments, including LSD experiments were going on. And he did this breathing, and he was told about a artist in New York who was meeting with people who believed they'd been abducted by alien beings. Mm-hmm. And his first reaction was, well, that's crazy. I mean, who could believe that? But one thing led to another. He met with this artist whose name was Bud Hopkins, a revered name in ufology. And that's what got John Mack started. He read letters that people sent to Bud Hopkins talking about their experiences. And he said, I need to check this out. This is wild. It is crazy because it, obviously doesn't exist in everyday reality the way we're used to it, but something is going on. So that's what got John Mack interested.
Yeah, it's at first he believed that these people who made these claims were suffering some form of mental illness, and but as you say, after reading the letters that Bud Hopkins had supplied, it actually piqued his interest, and it really did get him into the subject.
It did, and he was very well prepared. He really was an intellectual giant. He had written a book on nightmares, so he knew what nightmares were. So later on, when people said, "Oh, John, you don't understand. These people, are not meeting aliens. They're just having a nightmare," he could justly say, "No, I know what nightmares are. These are not nightmares. First of all, they don't always happen at night. They happen when people are driving in their cars, outside, walking. And in one case, a woman was driving a snowmobile, and she was abducted or encountered, had this experience. So he was very well prepared. He had written a book on childhood development, so he knew that children who are also coming forward with these strange stories were not making it up. He knew what mental illness looked like, and he decided pretty quickly that these people were not mentally ill. They weren't looking for publicity, because the last thing they wanted usually was to be identified as having these experiences. They were reluctant to come forward. So for all these reasons, he decided there was something genuine about this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I met John a number of times over in the States. And I'll say this because there are those that probably never met him, of course. And he was a lovely, lovely guy, very relaxed, very easygoing. And, it was tragic when we heard about, his accident and how he died. It's funny you should mention Lawrence of Arabia as well, Ralph. I worked with a friend of mine who worked in the Middle East for the Saudi military for, I think it was about 16 years. And he was a cartographer. And he was actually asked to replicate some maps for a book that was about Lawrence of Arabia. And about his, it was during his exploits during the war when they were, blowing up the railroad and things like that. So my friend, I'll not give out his name, but he's actually mentioned in the same line in a book as Lawrence of Arabia, and that's his claim to fame.
Carl Jung would call that a synchronicity.
Yeah. Well, I was this for another synchronicity. I'm actually about 30 miles from where Lawrence of Arabia was stationed after the war, because I believe he was stationed in the Bridlington area, if I'm correct there, Phil.
Oh.
Yeah, and of course he died in an accident as well. I believe it was.
Well, he did.
Yeah.
Motorcycle accident that John Mack spent some time, looking into, because he said Lawrence's demise was an accident, but it wasn't completely accidental. By then, Lawrence had become disillusioned. He had, done the great deeds he had. He had, witnessed horrible atrocities. He was kind of tired. I mean, he was also very shy, Lawrence. He didn't operate under his own name a lot of the time in the military. He didn't want, glory. He wanted to slip under the radar. So anyway, John identified pretty strongly with Lawrence, and he was fascinated by the idea of what was it, sort of an outlook of action and inner life. He was fascinated by Lawrence's makeup psychologically. He was a very strange guy, as you know. John Mack did take some time to discuss his sexual history, which was controversial, and entirely happy with that. But it was in a good cause. I mean, it helped to illuminate Lawrence's character. I don't have to talk too much.
I was just going to say, you as a well-versed journalist in the States, was it when you come to write this biography? Was it the man who grew into it, or was it what was subject itself of abductions, or was it a bit both?
Yeah, it was a bit of both. Again, I started off from the point of view of what was an esteemed psychiatrist doing. Getting involved in an area of alien abduction, which is so, it gets a lot of ridicule. Let's face it. You bring that up in any kind of circle, and you get smirks, and they give you sound effects, da 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 da. So he encountered that too. But what intrigued me is the idea that he would put his career at risk to look into this field, because he was courageous in that sense. I think he didn't really care what it would do to his career. He wanted to get to the bottom of it. And I mean, I'm envious of you that you met him, John, because he died obviously before I could meet him. But your description of him accords with what I had read. He was, very engaging. He attracted a lot of people, particularly women. He was very attractive to women and attracted two women, to the dismay of his wife Sally. But he wasn't a sneaky guy. I mean, he didn't sneak around. If he was attracted to somebody, he went for it. And then his wife understood that he was basically acting out some sort of trauma he had in his life when his mother died when he was very young, and he was always searching for something. That's a theme I develop in the book. But he was very attractive. He was tall. He was cobalt-eyed, as I said, and he really had a nice way with people, which enabled him to get their stories. They opened up to him.
Yeah, I mean, I can confirm that Ralph, he was, just a lovely guy. I mean, had you not known he was a Harvard professor, you would never have guessed that by talking to him. You would have known he was an educated man, obviously. But there was none of this, I'm the big professor guy, and, you must listen to me and I'm right. There was none of that. I think the last time I met him, we managed to have lunch together as well at a convention. And he was talking about some of his plans for the future. Sadly, that he wasn't able to go down that route. But I also knew Bud Hopkins. And,
really? Oh.
Yeah. I even had the pleasure of Bud come and stay with me.
Really?
Because I was a conference organizer for a long time, Ralph. So I would have people, and I worked on a couple of cases here in the UK. Bud assisted me, if you like.
Oh.
I got his ear, and I remember him telling me that he was working with a profession. He wouldn't even give out his profession. He just said a professional person. And of course, we have found out eventually that who he meant was Dr. Mack. And people have asked me about, the subject in general and the way that both the general public and the media treat the subject. And I have always said back in the 1990s, when a person like Dr. Mack stepped out of the shadows, this is, like you said, a Harvard professor, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, had more to lose than he had to gain by doing that. It gave the subject matter a huge air of credibility. And
it really did.
It did indeed.
And people are always grateful for that. Whenever I, go to a convention and talk to people in the field, John Mack's name is venerated. That he gave people permission to come forward with their stories, and the fact that he saw it as worthy of pursuit, gave it a lot of credibility and took it out of the shadows. I mean, it still has a long way to go, but Recently, you could see signs of a general willingness to much more in the States, I know, and I imagine elsewhere too. As a matter of fact, some other countries are ahead of us in terms of coming to grips with this. I know in France, the Cometa, and in South America, Brazil, other countries ahead, but certainly in the U.S., it's come a long way. So he deserves a lot of that credit.
Yeah. So, you've found this man, but sadly you've missed him. So how do you go about writing The Believer? The first biography about Dr. John. How would you start such an opus, Ralph?
Very difficult. I started off by reading as much as I could, including his two books. He wrote Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. He wrote that in 1994, and he got into trouble with Harvard for that. We can talk about that. And then 5 years later, he followed it up with Passport to the Cosmos, which is the book I read. So I read what he wrote. Then I read his biography of Lawrence. Then I read as many alien abduction books as I could, including Bud Hopkins' books, which predated John's interest, because Bud was a real pioneer. And he wrote, Missing Time before John was ever thinking about alien abduction.
Can I tell you a little story there,
yeah.
Ralph? My first book was called Without Consent, co-authored with a colleague of mine who was a journalist, Carl Nagasis, and it's all about alien encounters here in the UK. It also came out in 1994, and when I met Dr. Mack was talking to him about it, he said, I really enjoyed your book, Philip. I wish I'd written mine in a similar vein. I said, I really liked your book, John. I wish mine had sold as many as yours.
That's funny. So you were a pioneer too. Wow.
Well, I don't know about that, but sorry to interrupt, Ralph.
No, it's fascinating to hear that. But I want to tell you a story about Bud and John, because I tell it in my book, and it really stays with me. When John first heard about aliens and heard that a man named Bud Hopkins was, doing this research, and his first reaction was, "No, that's crazy." But then I said, he changed his mind. John Mack was in New York in December of 1990, and he was visiting Robert Lifton, his friend, who was an eminent psychiatrist himself, who had written the definitive book on Nazi doctors and their state of mind, how they could be, leaders in medicine and still serve the Nazis. And then Lifton had written a book on the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Anyway, he was a good friend of John Mack. So Mack was staying with him in New York. And the funny thing is, we talked about synchronicities. Robert Lifton knew Bud Hopkins from Cape Cod because Bud was an artist on Cape Cod, and Lifton, like all good psychiatrists, go to Cape Cod in the summer, which is why you can't get analyzed in the summer. So they knew each other. So John said to Lifton, who he was staying with, I might just give this Bud Hopkins a call. He's involved in some crazy stuff, but I might just give him a call. And by the way, John said, I know you know Bud Hopkins because you guys know each other from Cape Cod. Would you like to come with me? And then something very strange happened. Lifton's wife, BJ, pipes up and says to her husband, no, you have a choice about getting involved in this, and John doesn't. And boy, when I heard that story from Lifton, it blew me away, because here was like a Cassandra seeing what was going to happen, that John was going to get involved in this inextricably, and Lifton, who knew about alien abduction and UFOs and all that, actually was not going to get involved. But isn't that a great story?
It is. Yeah. It is indeed. It's peculiar.
Just a little earlier, Ralph, you mentioned, and you said we could get into this. His colleagues at the universities in the psychiatric profession. How did they actually react then to Dr. Mack getting involved in this?
Well, some of them supported him. He had good friends because he made friends easily, and they looked up to him. But a lot of them didn't, and a lot of them thought he was really losing it. There was some professional jealousy. I mean, after all, he had won a Pulitzer Prize. He'd written a bestseller. And you know that the very worst thing you can do in academia is succeed. That'll provoke the envy and distress of your colleagues. So he did that. He was very successful financially with the book, and intellectually with his Pulitzer Prize. So he had he had many detractors. And then, of course, Harvard was not officially happy with the attention he was getting with alien abduction. And there were trustees who said he's putting Harvard in a bad light. And I mean, the interesting thing I found is that Harvard is no stranger to anomalous research. William James, the father of psychology, was a eminent professor at Harvard 100 years ago, and he went to seances and he talked about, the unseen world and spiritualism and all that. So, you can't say that Harvard was adverse to the paranormal. It was more John's way of going about it. He was very enthusiastic, a little bit naive. So his superiors at Harvard were wondering, well, are you enabling these people who have these stories? Are you, feeding into their, delusions is what they thought they were, or are you being a good medical man and keeping your distance? So he wasn't really keeping his distance. He was sympathizing a great deal with his experiencers, as he called them. So, that's what happened at Harvard. He had some good friends, but also enemies.
So when we look at Dr. Mack's work, Ralph, was it a steady stream of things before he became convinced of that these experiences were having genuine accounts, or was the one event or one case that smacked him in the face and made him stand up and take notice? How did that come about in his research?
Well, it happened pretty quickly. There's one quote I have in the book, by the way, that I think is illustrative here. When he went out to Esalen to study holotropic breathing with a guy named Stan Grof, who was a Czech psychiatrist who worked with LSD, and he developed this breathing. When John went out there to work with Stan Grof to practice this breathing, he said later, John Mack said later, he opened up my psyche and the UFOs flew in.
That's yeah.
So to answer your question, he was sort of primed for expanding his horizon. He already realized that there was another world, an unseen world that he was just becoming aware of through this breathing, that he was able to access altered states of consciousness through the breathing. And then when he met Bud and heard about these letters from people and then started talking to these people himself, he realized pretty quickly he was onto something. And why he realized he was onto something was really pretty simple. He was, a very highly trained and competent psychiatrist. So he knew right away, the very first people he interviewed, that they were not mentally ill. They weren't crazy. And he knew, because they're so reluctant to talk to him, that they were not eager, they were not publicity seekers. They were not eager to tell their stories. What also convinced John that he was onto something was that the stories were really, by and large, very consistent. People were, they became aware of a UFO. They were surrounded by these small beings. They were beamed through windows and closed and walls, closed doors, onto some kind of a craft where they were subject to all kinds of pseudo-medical probes. and very often reproductive procedures where eggs were taken from women and sperm from men for production of a hybrid race, and then they would be reabducted later, the way they told John, and they would see their hybrid offspring. So that was sort of a basic story that was coming up again and again. So John said, well, the stories are pretty consistent, but they're not so much the same that everyone's repeating exactly the same story, which would be suspicious that they're following some playbook or something. So, and there were also fragmentary bits of evidence, the scoop marks on people who remembered being abducted and couldn't explain how they got these scars. There were areas where they remembered seeing a UFO land, and afterwards the grass was bent down or the foliage was disturbed. But probably most important were the little kids that John interviewed, sometimes as young as 2 years old, who said things like, little man, take me up into the sky. And John realized these kids are not, reproducing books that they had read or movies that they had seen. They were little kids. So all these things together made him realize pretty quickly that this phenomenon on some level was real.
Mm. It's interesting that you mentioned children there, because I have a question on my pad here. John went out to stay again with another old friend of mine who sadly no longer here, Cynthia Hind.
Oh yes,
in Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yeah.
The aerial school
Right.
mass sightings. Do you cover that in the?
I do.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it's a very important part of my book because of all the cases that came up, that's one of the top, 2 or 3 in terms of providing evidence, anecdotal evidence, but evidence that really jumps out at you. And what happened there was John was under investigation at Harvard at the time, going through a lot of grief with the Harvard committee, and he becomes aware of an incident in southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, where UFOs were seen flying over the airport, and then suddenly there was a report that a school outside Harare, the capital, had been home to some kind of a UFO landing, and 60 children about 8, 9, 10, 12, witnessed not only a landing, but 2 little beings coming out and interacting with the children. So John had heard about the story, which was just beginning to make the rounds. The BBC picked it up. A very interesting correspondent named Tim Leach. And so John rushed off to Zimbabwe with his partner at the time, a woman named Dominique, who has a big part in my book, and they interviewed the kids. And again, the children tell a consistent story that they were at recess when these glowing balls landed, and one was a ship, and the 2 little creatures got out, and with elliptical eyes like rugby balls, one kid said. And they communicated telepathically with the children that they were that the children should take good care of the planet, and that the beings were sad in some way. They were pathetic. The children got all these messages, but no adults were present. Interestingly, the teachers were all away. It was at recess, and actually one of the mothers was operating the sweet shop. She was inside, and she didn't want to leave because she was afraid the kids would grab the sweets and the money. So she stayed in the sweet shop, and a little girl came running in and shouted, "Aliens!" And the mother said, now, have good manners. If there are aliens out there, make sure they know we're nice and polite. So the parents, they didn't take it too seriously. But later on, when John Mack and Dominique interviewed these children, and it's on tape, and some of the drawings are in my book, the stories are very, very compelling.
Yeah, there's plenty of illustrations in the book as well. It is well worth getting, and the EB Awards were quite notable as well, because John Mack is stood next to Bud Hopkins there in that photograph. It's quite good.
Yeah.
One of the things what I'd like to do, Ralph, if you don't mind, is I'd just like to expand on the discussion a little bit, just slightly stepping away from Dr. Mack. And obviously one of the things that you are noted for is your work with, is it Leslie Kean? We
Yes.
pronounce it Kean, but Leslie Kean.
Kean.
Yeah, you're actually noted for a certain New York Times article, which I believe was released at December the 18th your time, December the 17th our time, 2017, known as Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program, which you was the co-author of with Leslie. How did you find out about this? How did you get involved with this?
Well, it had nothing to do with my book. I was working on the book, but I had actually left the Times by then. But I was contributing articles as a freelance. And Leslie, who was a good friend of mine, who had written a very high-level book on UFOs, and by the way, now her book on afterlife experiences called Surviving Death is the subject of a 6-part Netflix series.
Oh, excellent.
So yeah, Leslie is a pioneering investigative journalist in this field of anomalies and UFOs. Anyway, it happened in December of 2017 that she went down to Washington to meet with some people who were working on what was until then a secret Pentagon program to investigate UFOs. The program was called AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It had been funded with $22 million, which is a pittance in the Pentagon budget. And it was not known, it was not publicized, but they were keeping track of some sightings that had been going on involving Navy ships and Navy pilots. And more to the point, the man who was heading that office, a man named Lou Elizondo, was resigning because he was not getting enough support from the Department of Defense. So Leslie was privy to all this. She came back to New York and told me, and I said, this is a great story for the Times because nobody knew about this Pentagon program. Officially, the government was out of the UFO business with Project Blue Book in 1969.
Yeah.
When it said that there's nothing to see here, folks. Keep moving. But secretly, the government, of course, was very involved and very concerned. People who know knew that there was something going on here. They didn't know what these objects were, but they knew they existed. Anyway, so we took the story to the Times, and we had it, all on the record. Everybody we spoke to was named. There were no anonymous sources. We had the documents. We had the resignation letter of Lou Elizondo. So we had the story nailed down, and the Times editors, to their credit, did not give us a hard time. They saw that it was well documented. They realized it was an important story because nobody knew about this Pentagon program. Put it on the front page on a Sunday, and it caused a tremendous reaction. It made the story, first of all, mainstream worthy. So other media could pick it up, and we also released what became 3 Navy videos showing these objects, super fast objects surrounding, Navy jets.
Yeah, this would be the gimbal footage, wouldn't it? And so
yes,
on.
the gimbal footage, and another one called the Go Fast, because this object is zipping over the water. And we interviewed later a pilot, Dave Fravor, who said he saw one of these objects under the water, which was a mind blower because now it turns out they operate underwater as well as in the skies. The different media, water, air doesn't seem to make much of a difference to these things, whatever they are. So anyway, that was the story of that, and then we fleshed it out later with follow-up stories, interviewing some of the pilots, and they actually saw these things as giant tic tacs. And the last story was about briefings that were given to members of Congress concerning possible materials that had been recovered, which is still a very shadowy business where we can't get much information because it's all highly classified.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been able to really pursue the story in the New York Times, and I think it's really contributed to what people call disclosure.
Yeah. How did you feel personally then, Ralph, when, for want of a better explanation, you found out that the government had lied or attempted to lie for something like 70 years, that, as you said earlier, move on folks, there's nothing to see here, but whereas in reality, there was something, and that the government had lied to the, well, not just to the American citizens, but the British subjects, people in France, people in Germany, South Africa,
Right.
Australia, globally.
Well, I can't say I was too surprised because I never put a lot of faith in any, trust no one, trust nothing, Charles Fort, the great anomalist, said, accept only temporarily. Covering government all those years, I must say I have a healthy skepticism of what government bureaucrats say and what government agencies put out. So and I knew all the reasons why the government had taken the position it had. It was afraid of it didn't understand this phenomenon. It didn't want to panic people. It didn't want our adversaries to know how much we knew. For all those reasons, it was not too surprising that the government was not forthcoming. It didn't understand the phenomenon at all. What was more distressing is that the government not only lied about it, but it put out disinformation. We know from CIA documents now that the government actually pursued a campaign of discrediting people who were, looking into it, the MUFON types who were trying to, look into the mystery. So the government took steps. It altered some documents so nobody knew if they were reading real documents or fake documents. I mean, to this day, we see documents that look authentic, have all the right markings, and yet they've been altered in such a way as to make it cast doubt on the authenticity of the documents. So that might be to throw adversaries off the track, might be to just cause massive confusion, lots of things. But if you ask me, was I shocked that the government had lied? No.
So we do know that out of the article in the Times there came TTSA, the To the Stars Academy, and as you mentioned, Lou Elizondo had resigned and he became a member of TTSA. But we do know, I think, I understand anyway, that Lou Elizondo has now left TTSA. Do you know anything about that? Why he's left or why he's moved on?
Well, I don't know really. We've kept our distance from TTSA because it was, as laudable as the operation always was in terms of bringing, together a lot of money and talent to shed light on this issue. It always was mixed up with entertainment and the idea that it would fund television movies and different media projects. So we try to keep our distance from that. So we tried not to get involved with TTSA at all, to report on it, or to spend time on it. As I said, we applaud the instinct, but we did not want to mix up the Times credibility with TTSA.
Yeah. Earlier on, you mentioned the BBC. I think you said a BBC reporter, and I do know that the BBC actually quoted Dr. Mack once as saying that I would never say, yes, there are aliens taking people, but I would say there is a compelling, powerful phenomenon here that I can't account for in any other way. And he called it mysterious, basically. He just said it deserves further inquiry. I mean, is anything else going on that people are investigating this today still?
Well, I think he was being cautious. I think that comment came up in the course of the Harvard investigation when they were asking him whether he enabled people into thinking, yes, they really had been abducted by aliens, and he was saying, well, I don't tell them one way or the other, but I accept their experience. But yeah, he did give a lot of interviews, including to the BBC, and I remember reading one. And there was a lot of interest, obviously, in the UK, as we know from your own incidents there, the Rendlesham Forest and others. So it is an international phenomenon, clearly. And John realized that. Actually, he traveled all over the world chasing these episodes whenever something came up, and he went as far as Australia, actually. And there's a funny episode in the book where he goes to some really remote little island to try to interview indigenous people, because they have a whole history of folklore about being visited by little men and things like that. And so he and Dominique, his partner at the time, go down to this little island in the Arafura Sea, this little backwater place, and they're trying to make contact with the natives to see what they know. So they're sitting in the town square, waiting for people to come up to them, and the crowd sort of gathers, and John Mack begins like this. He said, we come from far away, and we're looking into stories about people who see, strange things in the sky. And one of the onlookers says, "Oh yeah, the X-Files. We watch that every week." So even there, he couldn't get away from the cultural, penetration of these stories. So it really is a worldwide phenomenon. He went to Brazil and he checked out some very strange. Brazil has, in some ways, the strangest stories of all, for some reason.
It does, yes.
Yeah. And he went there. He went to a lot of places. He visited the Dalai Lama in India, and shared what he knew about aliens, and the Dalai Lama, being very interested in spiritual things, contributed sort of his understanding of the unseen world. And that's a fascinating episode I put in my book, because it was never officially reported that the Dalai Lama was interested in alien abduction, and would never have been known, except John Mack kept transcripts of the 7 days of meetings. And I got access to that with his files. And he kept a sort of a running account of what he said, what the Dalai Lama said, what other people said. And it is fascinating to see that one of the world's great spiritual leaders was as mystified by this as anybody else.
So, after his research, his early demise, Ralph, did Dr. Mack come to a definitive conclusion about the abduction phenomena?
Almost in a negative way. I think he was more convinced in the beginning than at the end. He became more and more confused, actually. He was pretty certain when he first heard the stories from Bud Hopkins and he saw the letters that this was a real phenomenon that was actually physically happening to people in some kind of reality. And the more he looked into it and the more elusive he found it to be, he came away thinking, well, it's not happening in our reality. It must be happening in some other dimension, or some other reality must be penetrating our reality in some ways we don't understand. So he became less certain, which of course annoyed some of his experiencers, who thought he was, turning away from them and no longer validating their experience. But he said, I believe that they have endured a powerful experience, but I don't know what that is. And it's more important to see how it changed them, made them more, concerned about the fate of the earth, made them more spiritual, made them better people. He was more interested in that than what the ultimate nature of this phenomenon was, because he realized he could never get to the bottom of that. So in that sense, he changed, and he widened his perspective to include many other paranormal situations, such as crop circles, and he played around with the fortune-telling possibilities of Viking runes, the stones that people pull out of a closed bag, and if you can read them as to predicting the future. And eventually, life after death, he was pursuing a book about that, and possibly, suggesting that he could foretell his own death.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But what about yourself then, Ralph? I mean, you've been a career journalist. You've covered all kinds of things. Like you've said, you got used to the government lying to you. I mean, to be a politician, Ralph, you've got lies are part and parcel of the job, are they not?
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean.
So here you are. You've written the biography about this gentleman. What about you? What do you believe in? What do you think's going on?
Well, what I like to say is, first of all, John never liked to be asked, does he believe? And I'll tell you a little story about my title in that respect in a minute. But I like to say the same thing, that UFOs, for example, are not a question of belief. It's like asking somebody, do you believe in the ocean? Do you believe in the stars? Do you believe in the moon? I mean, these objects exist. Mm-hmm. We don't know what they are. But it's not a question of believing in them. I mean, they are there, whether we believe in them or not. Yeah. Unidentified objects are zipping around the skies and probably underwater. They've been caught on Navy, imaging devices. They've been seen by the most highly trained observers our government has, Navy pilots. So these things exist. And I believe that. So that's not a question of belief. That's a fact. They exist. I think I have become more spiritual in the pursuit of this book because it's opened my eyes to a range of experiences. I've never been abducted. I have not seen a UFO, just like John Mack. Neither of us has had personal experience, and John always said it's what kept him pure. He was a little envious of the people who had. He kind of disappointed that he was never abducted. He would have been a great abductee because he would have known what was going on. But it was never to be, because that's not how the phenomenon works. It doesn't do what it's expected to do. So in that sense, he and I are similar. We come to it pure. But I must say, the more I read about it, I'm astounded by by the depth and the veracity of these experiences, which seem to have no other explanation except that they occurred somehow in some way to these people, and not to other people, by the way. That's another mystery. Why some people, not other people? I may not have gained answers, but I certainly learned to ask a lot more questions.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in one of the conferences I organised some years back, our main speaker was Whitley Strieber, of course, the author of Communion, and I think it was the first time, possibly the only time, that Whitley had lectured in the UK. Oh. And at the end of his presentation, he was taking questions from the audience, and someone said, are we getting any closer to the truth or the facts? And I'll never forget what he said. He says, we're learning to ask better questions. That was what Whitley said. I've reminded him of that. He can't remember saying that, but I remember it vividly. We're learning to ask better questions.
I like that. Whitley is a great example of people whose stories do not follow the classic abduction the core narrative. Because one of the things that's so confusing about this whole world is that, yes, there's a basic story that a lot of these experiencers tell, but then many of the experiences do not fit into that core narrative. They don't involve reproductive procedures. They don't involve spaceships. It's just people being dislocated, finding themselves, in a place they didn't know how they got there. I mean, there's a story I tell in my book about Carrie Mullis, a famous Nobel Prize, not even Pulitzer, Nobel Prize winning chemist, who had a cabin in California. One night he went to his cabin and he was doing some maintenance around the yard at night, and he was carrying a flashlight, and he saw an object at the side of the field there, and he showed his light on it, and it was a raccoon with glowing eyes, and the raccoon spoke to him. It said, "Good evening, doctor." And the next thing he knew, it was morning. He was on the road. The flashlight was gone, never to be found. His clothes were dry. He didn't know how he got from the night before to the next day. And then he talked to his daughter, and she said the same thing had happened to her at the cabin. She found herself on the road, didn't know how she got there. And this guy is a Nobel Prize winning chemist. So he's, he couldn't explain what had happened to him. And again, that experience, it did not involve abduction, didn't involve a spaceship. It just involved a raccoon who spoke to him. So this field is so crazy, and I bring up Whitley because so many things that happen to him are also not part of the conventional narrative. He is a very interesting guy, and tells wonderful stories, and he's a great writer, as you know. The mystery gets deeper the more you look at it.
Yeah, we certainly live in a mysterious world. Certainly do. I wanted to ask you, Ralph, what has been the general reception to the book? That I know it's only been out a few days, but what has been the general reception to other Harvard professors or your colleagues?
Well, this is going to sound self-serving, but the reception has been excellent. The most gratifying to me are the reactions I get from people who knew John, who worked with him, members of his family including his sons, who said they recognize his portrait in the book. They think it's a very fair portrait. As I say, I record his flaws, his warts, as well as his attributes and his successes. So I do try to create a balanced picture. But people who know him and knew him a lot better than I did, because they knew him personally, said they found things in the book they didn't know, and they recognized the. Again, I had people who knew him, so imagine, what he would be like. By the way, there's nothing in this book that's, fabricated or speculative. It's all, every quote is something somebody actually said or that was taken from his own papers, etc. So, in that sense, I've been told I succeeded. So, I'm very gratified. It seems to be selling very well. I think they're running out of the first printing already. They ordered a second printing. High Road Books of the University of New Mexico Press. They've been very supportive and very, very happy with the book. New Mexico, of course, being a great place for my publisher to be located, because so much happens in New Mexico. I'm really very pleased so far.
Okay, do you want to tell us, Ralph, please, how we can purchase the book?
Well, Amazon has been selling it, and I don't know how they do with international orders. But first of all, it's available on Kindle, so anyone can get a PDF. And if you're really eager to read the book immediately, that's a very fast way to get it. And then you can read it right away. You don't have to wait for delivery. My publisher is negotiating with different foreign subsidiaries, so hopefully there'll be publication in other countries and maybe even translations. I think an audio book deal has just been struck, so it will be available on audio for people who like to hear their books read rather than. And I heard from a number of people who said, "When's it going to be out on audio?" Because I have bad eyesight, and I love to listen to books. It's great for long car rides. So Barnes and Noble, I know, has a good stock of books, and independent booksellers have them. So I don't know how it really works in the UK, whether you'd have to order it from abroad or whether.
No, you can get it on Amazon.co.uk. No problem, Ralph.
Oh, good. And of course, UK being a place where interest is huge in UFOs and alien abduction because so many incidents happen there. And Nick Pope, by the way, has been very supportive. He gave me a nice blurb, and he wrote something up. And he was actually at John Mack's memorial service. After John was run down, they had a service for him in, I believe it was just outside London, I'm not sure. But because everything that John did was documented, including his memorial, there's a wonderful video of the service. And it took place at a, and I forgot the name of it. It's in my book, but it's a funeral park, and I think not far from London. And they had the casket come in and a figure in a black suit with a top hat. I said, looking like the very image of death itself, escorted the hearse. I mean, and it was very touching. John's friends from the T.E. Lawrence Society were there. And by the way, Montague Keene's widow, who was a great friend of John, who he was staying with when he was run down, she sort of held vigil for the body afterwards and got messages from John that, I looked down at my broken body and tried to decide whether to go or to stay. And I decided to go. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, but I guess I was saying that there should be a lot of interest in the UK.
Excellent.
I'm sure there will be. I mean, we're not wrong, and we're running out of time. One thing I wanted to ask, Ralph, there's a lot of things now in the possibility of further details from the US government, the Department of Defense, or whoever. Mm-hmm. Do you think we're going to see any of that in the coming months?
Yeah, I think, I don't know when the report will be ready. I think there's a little over-expectation that the report will be, fulsome and imminent and all that. I think it's going to take a little longer than a lot of people hope, and it'll be a difficult report to compile because there's, so much information to gather. So, but I think we're on the right track, and I think there will be more information. The government has definitely changed its posture. It's not dragging its feet like it used to. It now wants pilots to report encounters. The Air Force is getting involved for the first time in addition to the Navy. So I think that's all positive.
Yeah, the Navy actually changed their reporting procedure, didn't they? About 18 months ago, was it?
Yeah, they're now encouraging pilots to come forward. It used to be a career ender to say that you had an encounter. They refer you to the head shrinker. But now they're encouraging it. So that's all good.
One last thing before we wrap up, Ralph, and this is just my way of thinking. With regards to your biography of John Mack, do you think that might make it into television land? Is that something?
Yeah, I'm hoping. Yeah. I'm hoping. My agent has just concluded discussions with a filmmaker, and we're moving on to the next step. I've always thought that would make a great film, either a documentary or a feature. So it's promising. I think his story is very dramatic. It has all the elements of good motion pictures. So I'm hoping.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Well, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and The Passion of John Mack is out now. You can order it internationally, so I'm pretty sure that wherever you are in the world, you'll be able to get either a Kindle or a hard copy or a paperback. And like Ralph had just been saying, it should shortly be available also as an audiobook, which I know is gaining in popularity. On behalf of myself and Chris, Ralph, we'd like to thank you for your time this evening. I'm sorry it's passed so quickly. I've still got a page full of questions on my notepad in front of me, but when I order the book, and I will be doing, I'm sure a lot of those questions will be answered when I read it anyway. So from me, Philip, thank you very much for being our guest this evening.
Well, thank you. It was a real pleasure. Your questions were great.
Okay, thanks very much from Chris as well, Ralph. Very nice to speak with you. And
likewise. I'm glad we could do it so quickly. So thank you for recouping.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for joining us. Absolutely brilliant. Really enjoyed that. Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network.
It's in the trees. It's coming.